works. Okay, machine.
I should use the mic at all times for video purposes, yes?
Hello? There we go. Good evening, everyone. I guess we'll get started. It's just after 6 o'clock. This is really projects, so it's great. I don't have to wonder if anyone can hear me. My name is Eva Salinas. I'm the managing editor of OpenCanada.org. It is a foreign affairs news site, which hopefully some of you are familiar with. It's really great to be here. I came into Ottawa. I'm not normally based here, and I love coming to events here in Ottawa. We have such a close connection with policy and government, so it makes talks like this particularly pertinent. So thanks for having me, University of Ottawa. And before I introduce the three panelists here with me, I'll be moderating tonight's discussion, and then we'll break into questions for the audience after a bit of a discussion up here. I'll give a bit of a brief introduction to the topic that I think some of you may have already a background or interest in, but just to kind of recap the context in which we'll be speaking tonight. Almost a year ago, so January last year, a very historic nuclear deal was struck between Iran and the P5+1 countries, not including Canada, part of those negotiations. But that was considered a turning point really for renewed relations with Iran, led by Barack Obama. It was also coming at a really interesting time because many would say that relations between Canada and Iran were at a low, and were at a low when Justin Trudeau was elected just months before. After the deal, we saw economic sanctions lifted, some economic sanctions lifted on Iran. Also, Canada also lifted sanctions shortly after. And at the same time, we had a new prime minister, a new foreign affairs minister, that were really projecting a new kind of approach to foreign policy here in Canada. And a lot of that centered around diplomacy or renewed relations. And Iran came up quite quickly as an example of a country where this kind of approach to foreign policy, we would see a difference. So we were given notice that Canada would renew its relations with Iran. Of course, as I mentioned, there was a low between Iran and Canada, I think most markedly with the closure of the embassy in 2012. This past year, these events, at the same time, Iran has had a human rights record that has been considered quite abysmal, report after report. We'll talk about the UN resolutions against Iran, or about Iran. There have been a few notable cases of with a Canadian connection in Iran that I think that received a lot of attention here in Canada, but there are many other cases as well that don't necessarily have a Canadian connection, and I'm referring to the religious minority groups, to activists, journalists, political opponents who are routinely detained or imprisoned in Iran. So it's with this backdrop that we're talking tonight about Canada's renewed relations. Is it possible? I think there seems to be a consensus that there should be renewed relations, but we'll talk about that. If so, is it possible? And also, what is it going to achieve? What can it achieve We also have a question that, that maybe I didn't have on my list a few weeks ago, and that is what a Trump presidency means for relations with Iran and Canada's path forward as well. So I'll introduce the three panelists. I'll ask them each to kind of give a few introductory thoughts to those questions, just for a few minutes, and then we'll get into the discussion up here. So I'll introduce first Michael Petru. He's a three-time National Magazine Award-winning journalist and regular contributor to OpenCanada.org. He's reported from across Europe, Africa, the Middle East. He also, his latest book is This Your First War, travels through the post-9/11 Islamic world, won the Ottawa Book Award for Nonfiction. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Mariam Nayab Yazdi is an activist, writer, and consultant. She works in the field of human rights and social change. She's the founder of PersianToEnglish.com and has founded numerous campaigns calling for the release of political prisoners in Iran, including a global campaign for Canadian permanent resident Saeed Malekpour. And we'll also get into Homa Hoodfar's case, and she was released since we conceived of this panel just last month. Mariam is currently working on a project aimed at strengthening the Iran human rights narrative in the Western mainstream by helping to elevate the voices of native Iranian changemakers, boost their visibility, and increase opportunities for the world to better support them. And then I have University of Ottawa's own Thomas Junot. So some of you may know him already. His recent books include Squandered Opportunity, Neoclassical Realism in Iranian Foreign Policy, and Iranian Foreign Policy since 2001, Alone in the World, which he was a co-editor. So thank you very much. Welcome to the three of you. I'll start maybe with you. I'll give each the opportunity to speak to some of these general questions. Let's start with you, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone for being here, including to a number of my current and former students who did answer my invitation, so thanks for that. Thank you to the co-editor to the book you mentioned, who's sitting right there too. So my starting point for my talk is that the Liberal government's commitment to re-engage or to re-establish diplomatic relations with Iran is a good idea. That's my starting point. But reopening the embassy in Iran is much easier said than done, and that's largely, not exclusively, but largely a legacy of actions undertaken by the previous government, the Conservatives. The way I frame this, and this is a bit of a non-technical term, but the Conservatives booby-trapped our relations with Iran. That is largely, not exclusively, but largely why after 1 year of Liberal government, we still don't have an embassy, and there is little public sign of progress at least. As Eva mentioned, under the Conservatives, a very hostile approach towards Iran. I won't go over that. Iran was the greatest threat to international peace and security, which is something that was said on multiple occasions, and that led in 2012 to the shutting down of the embassy. There are also... Non, cet événement est en anglais, je suis désolé. There are also less visible aspects of the Conservatives' actions towards Iran. One of them is the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, which was passed a few years ago, and alongside modifications to an existing act, the State Immunity Act, it empowers victims to sue perpetrators of terrorism and countries that are specifically listed as supporting them for loss or damage that occurred anywhere in the world. And this is a key point, anywhere in the world. There are only two countries on this list, and they are Iran and Syria. Among other implications, this process allows the seizure of property owned by Iran in Canada in connection with a court judgment against it. So it is in this sense that the Conservatives booby-trapped our relations with Iran, because I don't know what their specific intention was. The result certainly is that it massively complicates any future improvement, specifically the re-establishment of diplomatic relations. I have to assume that was their intent. If it was not their intent and that they simply miscalculated, then it is probably worse in terms of policy making. Moving ahead, Ottawa faces two scenarios, to either try to reestablish relations by keeping Iran on the list or by delisting. The first scenario of not delisting appears more likely, at least for now. Stéphane Dion has said this on a few occasions. Canada has no intentions of delisting Iran, at least until there is a significant improvement in human rights. It's not completely clear everything that this implies, but Global Affairs has said that being listed as a state supporter of terrorism doesn't prevent contact with Iranian authorities, and that it probably, on paper at least, doesn't prevent or preclude the reestablishment of diplomatic relations. But it's the politics of it that are very complicated. Re-establishing relations without delisting Iran obviously exposes the government to criticism domestically by the Conservatives in particular, that they are engaging, as per Canadian law, a state sponsor of terrorism. And this, technically speaking, is accurate in the sense that it is the fact that Iran supports Hezbollah and that Iran supports Hamas, and that as per the Canadian government, Hamas and Hezbollah are terrorist entities. Whether you agree with that or not, that's the position of the Canadian government. This scenario faces another major hurdle besides the Canadian domestic politics. From the Iranian perspective, it is not appealing. I'm not aware of definitive and formal public statements by the Islamic Republic on this, but this makes just common sense. They are not particularly interested in re-engaging relations with a state that formally lists them as a supporter of terrorism. Besides that, and that matters a lot, re-establishing diplomatic relations would expose, again, Iranian assets in Canada to seizure by Canadian courts, which is also obviously very unappealing for Iran. According to the second scenario, Ottawa could delist Iran. Procedurally, this is relatively straightforward in the sense that the designation is the result of a decision of cabinet. So in principle, Iran could be removed as the result of an order in council. So that doesn't imply new legislation. It's more straightforward. This could be done as part of a built-in review process or as a result of a formal letter written by the Iranian government to Canada asking for delisting. The latter is highly unlikely. I have a hard time imagining Foreign Minister Zarif sending a letter to Foreign Minister Dion saying, please delist us. And that would be legitimizing a process that they obviously disagree with. That would also leave open the question of what to do with cases currently before Canadian courts as per the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act. Domestically, again, this is politically challenging for the Trudeau government if they take this delisting option, since that would equate basically with saying that Iran is not a state sponsor of terrorism, which again, factually is inaccurate because Iran supports Hezbollah and Hamas, which as per the Canadian government are terrorist entities. It would also obviously expose the government to serious criticism, including from within. There's a faction in the Liberal Party, around, for example, former Minister Erwin Cutler, that doesn't like this alternative at all. Another challenge to all of this, whatever option is taken, the listing or delisting, is the reality that also helps explain the very slow pace of progress, that this is not a priority for either country. The Canadian government says it wants to do this, but it has many other things to think about. Iran's foreign and security policy plate, or its agenda, is extremely full right now, as you can imagine. And re-establishing relations with Canada may be desirable for some elements within the Iranian regime, close to President Rouhani, showcasing the success of the strategy of engagement. Ultimately, it's just not a priority for Iran, so that makes things move even slower. So just to finish then, it's not clear where things go from here, given the very serious difficulties of both scenarios I mentioned, delisting or keeping on the list. So ultimately, there may be two other scenarios that could emerge a bit farther down the road. So a third scenario would be that discussions get bogged down because of all the complexities I mentioned on both sides, and by default, you basically get a perpetuation of the status quo, which means no embassies. And that, as I'm happy to discuss after this, would be very unfortunate because it is not in Canada's interest not to have an embassy, in my view. A fourth outcome could see the emergence of some kind of a compromise between what we have now, i.e. nothing, and what we hope to have, an embassy. What form this compromise could take, I don't know. At this point, there has been no discussion of this on the Canadian side, not on the Iranian side as far as I know, but basically some kind of middle solution that would allow both sides to save face, whether it's an interest section, you know, somewhere between no embassy and an embassy or some other form, I don't know, but that may be a fourth option to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, would you like to?
I would. Is this microphone working? It is? Sure, I'd like to talk about, I suppose, the form that I think Canada's relations with Iran should take going forward, and the principles that should guide, I suppose, that evolution. I think Canada, like Kamal, I think Canada should re-engage with Iran. I think that re-engagement should be limited. I think it should be guided by pragmatism. I think it should be honest, and I think it should be clear-eyed. By honest and clear-eyed, I'm referring to a number of things, but principally I think is in the realm of human rights. And this has been a major pillar in the way that the Liberal government has proposed a re-engagement. Second, the honest talk about re-engagement as a means of improving human rights in Iran. I don't think that's true. I don't think that if we look at other examples, even beyond Iran for a second, engagement with the world by China has not improved human rights in China. And in Iran, if you look at to give one metric, the number of executions that have taken place in Iran since the Rouhani presidency far outstrip anything that went on during the government of Ahmadinejad. It almost seems, well, it doesn't almost seem, it seems that with international engagement comes increased domestic oppression. So I think that is a false justification on the part of our government. To give two more examples, Zara Kazemi, of course, tortured, raped, and murdered while we had diplomatic relations with Iran. Halma Hudfar released when we didn't. So I think as we move forward with this re-engagement, I think we need to be, or at least our government needs to be a little bit more honest in terms of what we realistically can accomplish and what our principles or our guiding or motivating principles are in that. A second one, again, in this theme of being, I suppose, clear-eyed and honest about the re-engagement process, is to recognize that fundamentally our interests, our national interests, and Iran's do not align. And this goes far beyond Israel and support for Hezbollah and Hamas. Iran is the primary reason that the wretched regime of Bashar al-Assad still persists in Damascus, which in turn is responsible for the massive displacement of 12 million people, the biggest exodus since the Second World War, and all the ramifications that has for the region, which we often forget as we strain our arm, patting ourselves in the back for taking 25,000 Syrians, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what the surrounding countries are dealing with. And that is the result of Bashar al-Assad, of course, Vladimir Putin, of course, but also the regime, but also the government of Iran. And also, we could talk about the Iranian actions in Canada, when we did have diplomatic relations in terms of front organization, things like that. This is not a government with which we have a lot of overlapping interests. Finally, I think, again, on this theme of being clear-eyed and realistic, is recognizing that what we can achieve. And this speaks a little bit to what Kamal was saying about it not being a priority for either country. Iran is not the United States, it's not even China. I mean, yes, there are business interests that Canada has there, but we don't have an enormous amount to gain from a business perspective, which means that we shouldn't sell cheaply what we have. It shouldn't sell cheaply our implicit recognition. Now, I do think we should re-engage. I just think that we should bear in mind the limited nature of what's at stake here. So, I mean, look, absolutely there are benefits. I think we should reestablish relations. I think that Iranian Canadians have a right to bring their relatives over with far greater ease than they do now, and I think that matters. However, I think if we are going to engage, we should not be shy about prioritizing our values, and principally among these human rights. We currently sanction Iran for ballistic missile and nuclear-related matters. There are people within the Iranian government and should be, or arguably should be, sanctioned for human rights violations. If we're going to engage on a government-to-government basis, I think we should also not be shy about engaging with Iranian civil society. And I think, Mariam, I'm sure is going to talk about Saeed Malakpour, a former Canadian permanent resident who's jailed in Iran. And I mean, my heart agrees with the idea that if we are going to establish diplomatic relations, at the very least we should get Saeed released. Although I have to say, I'm also uncomfortable with the transactional nature of that, because I'm afraid that establishes a precedent which could be exploited in the past. That said, I think the underlying principle of prioritizing human rights should be a priority in our re-engagement, and also just again keeping clear-eyed about the fact that this is a government that is hostile to our interests, hostile to its own citizens in many cases, and I think that needs to be in the forefront of the Canadian government's mind as it navigates this reestablishment of relations going forward.
I also think that I'm not against re-engaging with the Iranian authorities, but I think that we have to first consider what is the purpose of the dialogue, what is Canada gaining from the dialogue, and our Canadian values, which are human rights values, are they going to be compromised in the process? There's a notion out there that a lot of people in the West, a lot of governments as well in the West, think that once the sanctions are lifted and the economy in Iran improves, so will the human rights situation. This is assuming that there are members in the regime who are adamant for the human rights situation to improve, and they're pushing for that when there is absolutely no evidence to support that. And so this is troubling, because this argument assumes that the human rights situation in Iran has gotten worse as a result of the sanctions, and this is a myth, this is false. And they also say that once the sanctions are lifted, Mr. Rouhani will gain more power and space to introduce reforms. But we have to ask ourselves, is Rouhani's intentions to improve the human rights situation in Iran? Have we seen any signs from Mr. Rouhani that he wants to improve the situation of human rights in Iran? The answer is no, not yet, and his term is almost done. Since Rouhani since he's been the president of Iran, we have seen a 40% increase in executions in Iran. That's about an average of 2 to 3 people a day that are executed in Iran. In 2015, the Iranian authorities almost executed nearly 1,000 people. And most of these people are being executed for drug-related charges, and they're tried behind closed doors. And we're not actually even sure if that's the real reason they're in prison. The regime operates on lawlessness. So what we have to do here is see what does Canada want to do here? Do they have a short-term plan? What is their short-term? If they have a short-term plan, it's for economic gain, or is it better to have a long-term plan? A long-term plan is one that supports Iranian civil society. So through engagement, you put conditions on the engagement, and the conditions are human rights improvements. So for example, if you just focus on the short term, which is economic gain, and you ignore the human rights, that's what the American government is doing right now. A lot of the EU is doing that right now. There's no talks about human rights. It's not a priority in their talks. So as a result of that, Iranian civil society is still suffering. That's why we haven't seen any human rights improvements, because it's not part of their talks. We are seeing no improvement, and it's actually getting worse when it comes to the death penalty, and also when it comes to Iranian human rights activists being arrested. We have Nargis Mohammadi, who is an Iranian human rights defender who does what I do, but inside Iran, which is 100 times more brave. And She has a 15-year prison sentence right now, 16-year prison sentence right now, and she's in prison. So we have to, I'm going to give a warning here, because what is happening, okay, if we just focus on the economy, improving the economy, and ignore the human rights, Iranian civil society will continue to be fragile. Iranian civil society is extremely fragile. So what happens is, when a society is fragile and they feel alone, because Iranian people do feel alone, they don't have any basic rights, they don't have freedom of speech, expression, or thought. They headed to the streets in 2009, up until 2011. Their slogans were for human rights and democracy, and the world, in a sense, ignored them. So when people of closed societies, any dictatorship, they feel alone, they're going to feel, they're going to lack confidence and self-worth. And as a result of that, the warning is, this regime is going to crumble eventually through corruption. It's going to collapse on itself. Within the regime, there's so many factions that are fighting among each other. This regime is going to crumble eventually. So it's not a smart long-term plan to support the regime, but support the civil society. Imagine if the regime falls tomorrow. The civil society in Iran is too fragile. It doesn't have enough confidence to handle the regime falling. And there's a lot of different ethnic and religious minorities in Iran. And what could happen is we can very well end up in a sectarian war, a civil war in Iran, which could lead to extremists, more extremists to be born, like ISIS and others. And this could be disastrous. It could even be worse than what's happening in Syria right now. But imagine if civil society in Iran is strong and they're confident because of our support. Then what happens then is, once the regime is collapsing, the people can take control of their own destiny with solidarity from us. And right now we have there's a one Canada-linked prisoner left in prison, Saeed Malikpour. He's been a political hostage in Iran for the past 8 years. He's completely innocent in the sense that the Iranian authorities have no evidence against him except forced confessions extracted under torture. I work on his case, I've seen his case file, and I've seen the legal documents. That's the only evidence they have against him. So yes, Canada, when they're planning to re-engage with Iran, they have to put human rights, they have to put a condition on human rights improvements. And Saeed Malikpour, as a Canada-linked prisoner, should obviously be on the top of the agenda he has to be released before anything else can happen. However, as Michael said, it's not enough to just get Saeed Malikpour released, because if that's the case, then we're going to end up in a situation like US and UK, where they say, okay, we'll release these prisoners and we'll deal with you in terms of for the nuclear talks. Well, the IRGC, who's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is taking a lot of these hostages, they see this as an opportunity to make money. They see this as, okay, well, we're going to take some Iranian Americans or Iranian UK citizens, and you're going to give us money for it. Why would they stop? They're a gang. They don't follow any type of law. So we have to be careful. Canada's in a very unique position here to basically say, yes, Saeed Malikpour has to be released, but we also have to see human rights improvements in general in Iran, such as freedom of assembly, religious and ethnic minority rights, like the Baha'is in Iran, and the Sunni Kurds in Iran, and many other ethnic and religious minorities in Iran, and free and fair elections, and so on. There's a list, and what Canada can do is offer the Iranian authorities the choice to start somewhere. They don't have to tell them, you have to do this. But this is our list of things that are important to us as Canadians. Now, you go choose where you want to start. But we have to see improvements in human rights relations before we start fully engaging with you.
Lots to dive into from those three perspectives, so thank you. I guess just listening to the three of you, this question around can Canada put some kind of, whether you were advocating for it, for human rights conditions on a kind of re-engagement. But to know whether Canada will do that, I think we need to ask on why they are deciding to re-engage and how that fits into a foreign policy approach. Tona, you mentioned that it's not necessarily a priority for either of the countries, Iran or Canada right now. It's not at the top of the list. Maybe we don't see a justification. They're not, it wouldn't be such a big business opportunity. Obviously opportunities, but maybe not to justify it being at the top of the list. Michael, you mentioned the framing of how it's been spoken of this past year, that Dion has mentioned human rights and improving human rights as something directly related to the reason behind it. But I'm just curious to know your views on where you think it fits into the current government's foreign policy approach and why they are talking about Iran. If it's not necessarily a priority, what does it represent?
Where do human rights fit, or where does Iran fit more generally?
Re-engagement with Iran.
Well, re-engagement with Iran, it was a campaign commitment by the Liberals. It was genuine, but it was also probably a way to distinguish themselves from the previous government, which is a very natural thing that opposition parties do in elections that show that there's a difference. We're stopping the airstrikes in Iraq, engaging with Iran, and a few other things like that. But the reality is that Canada has never been strongly present in Iran. Even pre-sanctions, our trade was very small with Iran. Our embassy was small, our diplomatic engagement with Iran was small because of conscious decisions, the controlled engagement policy before 2010, whereby because of human rights, because of Zara Kazemi, we purposefully decided to limit our engagement. But even beyond that, Canada is a relatively small country. We are focused on North America. We are focused on NATO in terms of our foreign policy priorities. We're trying to diversify towards Asia. And our engagement with the Middle East, especially with a country like Iran, is not even secondary. It's a third-tier priority. In the best of cases, we could expand trade a bit with Iran. There would be opportunities for Bombardier and for a few others, and that's all good. There would be a few opportunities for engagement with Iran. It's an important regional power. There would be reasons to engage on the consular level because of some of the reasons that were discussed. One other benefit of having the embassy in Iran for Canada before 2012 was that the Americans weren't there. So from an American perspective, having the Canadians there as eyes and ears on the ground, as a channel, is always useful. It's not something huge for the Americans, but it's useful. So if you add all of these small things up, it adds to a relatively small whole. So that's all to say that it would be in Canada's interest to re-engage, but all of these interests that it has, trade, strategic, consular, the US dimension, human rights, it adds up to something that matters, but only second or third tier priority.
Michael, I'm wondering what you think, how this fits into a challenge for this government on how they balance trade and business interests, and especially because the framing is often around human rights and diplomacy, how they those two intersect with this government, and how big that challenge is. And I'm thinking Iran, isn't alone. We've seen more criticism on Saudi Arabia, and obviously the arms deal that was made there. But we haven't necessarily, maybe we're going to hear those kinds of questions for Iran, but we're not there yet because the process is just beginning. But how do you think that fits into the larger challenge for this government, because they are trying to reframe their foreign policy approach to balance those interests? Do you think this poses a challenge for the government?
Should I have a microphone, or is this working? I think that I don't think that trade and business concerns was the overriding motivation for the Liberal government driving the re-engagement policy. I think because, as Thomas said, the opportunities, they're there. They absolutely are there. There's recently a delegation of Iranian MPs in Canada that were touring some aviation-related businesses in the last few weeks. So those opportunities are there if a Canadian company were to land the sort of deal that we have with the LAVs with Saudi Arabia, then I would absolutely expect criticisms to rise to the same level as they have regarding the Saudi deal, which I think would be appropriate. I don't think business was a motivating issue. As I said earlier on, I don't think human rights was an entirely honest as a motivating issue, just because I don't think that it's realistic to expect human rights in Iran to improve through re-engagement. I think it fits into the larger liberal idea of engaging even with people with whom Canada has differences with. I don't think it's all that different philosophically than re-engaging with Russia. So that is, I suppose, a political philosophy which is underlining the concrete steps on the ground. And look, I don't think the Conservatives were any different. You know, one among several reasons given by the previous Conservative government for severing relations was danger to diplomatic staff. That could be true through a number of conversations on the record and off the record. I've never found conclusive evidence that was a major factor, and I think it's worth pointing out that the British, whose embassy was attacked, are now back in Iran. So just to sum up, I think that their re-engagement or severing relations fit into kind of a larger philosophical framework regarding what might be called, in the Conservative perspective, a principle. They would describe it as a principle of foreign policy, and then with the Liberals would be the emphasis on re-engaging even with people with whom we have severe and serious differences with.
Just a very quick point on the threat to diplomats in Tehran. In a very narrow sense, that was real, in the sense that diplomats in Tehran were subjected to harassment, to